Imagine being thrown out of a place you've relied on for support, not because you've done anything wrong, but simply because someone judged you for what they saw on the surface. That's what happened to Maggie Collins, a woman in a wheelchair, as she was forcibly removed by security from a local store. But the story didn't end there. Maggie wasn't just any woman. She had a lawyer who wouldn't let the injustice slide. Why was she thrown out, and how far would her lawyer go to make things right? This isn't just about an unfair act. It's about standing up, no matter how small or immobile the body. Maggie Collins had lived her whole life defying odds. In her early 30s, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, MS, in her 20s. What started as slight discomfort became a daily battle for her body. Still, Maggie was resilient. She had a positive outlook, surrounded by friends and family who admired her strength. She worked as a freelance writer from home, able to manage the unpredictable nature of her condition, but she found solace in the small outings she could still manage, like trips to the local grocery store. Maggie knew how to navigate the world in her wheelchair, and she'd made peace with her physical limitations. However, things took a turn when, one afternoon, Maggie entered Keenan's Market, the local grocery store she had been visiting for years. It was a bustling place, full of life, the scent of fresh produce in the air, the clattering of shopping carts, and the sound of customers talking and laughing. But on that particular day, Maggie's world collided with an unpleasant encounter that would shake her belief in the kindness of others. Maggie, as usual, was navigating the aisles, browsing through the shelves, when security officer Dan, a large burly man in his mid-40s with a stern expression, approached her. Dan had worked at the store for several years and was known for his strict enforcement of store policies. But his approach to Maggie that day felt different. Without greeting her, he immediately told her she would have to leave the premises. Confused, Maggie asked why. "You're causing a disruption," he said bluntly, motioning toward a small gathering of shoppers who had momentarily stopped to look at her as she maneuvered her wheelchair around a narrow aisle. Maggie, shocked by his accusation, tried to explain that she was just shopping, just like any other customer. But Dan was unyielding. He insisted she was blocking traffic, even though Maggie was carefully trying to navigate the store without impeding anyone's path. When she attempted to reason with him, Dan's tone grew harsher. That's when he called for backup. Another guard approached, and before Maggie could react, she found herself being physically escorted to the front doors of the store. It wasn't just a removal, it felt like an expulsion. As she struggled to understand what was happening, the cold gust of wind greeted her as she was pushed out onto the street, leaving behind the store that she had once thought of as a second home. As Maggie sat outside the store, shaking with anger and humiliation, her mind raced. What just happened? Why had she been treated like that? Was it because of her disability? Little did she know, the events of that day were just the beginning. Maggie, still sitting on the curb, quickly grabbed her phone and made one call. Her lawyer, Sarah Jensen. Maggie's lawyer, Sarah Jensen, was someone Maggie had trusted for years. Sarah was a no-nonsense lawyer, always quick to pick up the phone when Maggie needed advice. She was passionate about advocating for the underdog and had built her reputation on cases that seemed hopeless. When Sarah answered Maggie's call, she could sense the distress in her friend's voice. Maggie described the humiliating treatment she had just endured, and Sarah immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. The injustice wasn't just about Maggie being thrown out. It was about how she was treated simply because of her disability. Sarah knew that there was a deeper issue at play, and she wasn't about to let Maggie's experience go unnoticed. The more she listened, the more she realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. There was a pattern of mistreatment toward people with disabilities that needed to be addressed. Sarah took a deep breath and promised Maggie she would help. She would make sure Keenan's Market would answer for what had happened. Sarah immediately began gathering information, contacting the store to request a formal statement and review of the security footage. When the store management responded, they claimed Maggie wasn't removed due to her disability, but because she was disrupting the flow of business. The phrase stuck with Sarah, disrupting the flow. It felt like a convenient excuse, a way for the store to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. But Sarah wasn't buying it. She knew that this wasn't just a case of a customer causing problems. This was a case of discrimination masked by an overly broad policy. As Sarah dug deeper into the store's history, she uncovered a troubling pattern. She found that Keenan's Market had a history of profiling and removing people who were perceived as troublesome, which often included people with disabilities, the elderly, or those who didn't fit the typical consumer mold. The more she discovered, the more determined she became. She wasn't just fighting for Maggie now, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been wrongfully treated because of their circumstances. The stakes were high. Sarah knew that if she took this case to court, it could set a precedent for how people with disabilities were treated by businesses. But the legal battle wasn't going to be easy. The store would fight back, of course. They would do everything they could to protect their reputation and cover up their past mistakes. Sarah understood that the fight wasn't just about winning, it was about exposing a system that treated people like Maggie as if they didn't matter. But she was ready. As Sarah began preparing for the legal battle, the tension between Keenan's Market and Maggie's side escalated. Maggie's humiliation had turned into anger, and her resolve to see justice served grew stronger every day. What had started as a simple, hurtful encounter had turned into a war, one that would challenge the very foundation of how people with disabilities were treated in the public space. Sarah's strategy was set. She would go after Keenan's Market not just for what they did to Maggie, but for what they had done to so many others before her. Maggie sat in her small apartment, the phone cradled against her ear as Sarah Jensen's voice came through with clear determination. "We've got this, Maggie. We're not backing down. We're going to expose them for what they did." Even though Sarah's words were comforting, Maggie could feel the weight of everything they were about to face. This wasn't just about a wrongful eviction from a store. This was about something bigger. Her dignity, her right to be treated fairly, her place in a world that so often saw her as less. Her mind raced. She wasn't just battling an institution. She was up against a system that still failed to recognize her rights. "I'm not worried about the store," Maggie said quietly, looking out the window at the busy street below. "I'm worried about the next time, when someone else like me walks in and gets treated the same way." Sarah paused and Maggie could hear the deep breath she took before responding. "That's exactly why we're doing this. If we can make them pay for what they did to you, it might prevent others from facing the same thing. You're doing more than just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every person who gets shoved aside just because they don't fit the image people expect." Maggie couldn't help but let out a small sigh. She had spent so many years feeling like an outsider. Even before her diagnosis, she had always felt like something was missing, an internal tug of war between her dreams and the reality of her limitations. The wheelchair was just the latest symbol of her difference, one that made people uncomfortable and unsure how to treat her. But this was different. She wasn't going to let them erase her simply because of the chair. As Sarah and Maggie prepared for the case, the stakes began to rise. Sarah spent long hours poring over documents and researching Keenan's Market's history. She dug through past complaints, spoke with former employees, and even reached out to other customers who had been mistreated in the store. The deeper Sarah dug, the more troubling the pattern became. Keenan's Market, despite its outward image as a friendly community hub, had a darker side. Sarah uncovered multiple complaints dating back years, cases where people with disabilities or other perceived disruptive individuals had been forced out of the store, with little regard for their rights. One of the complaints was eerily similar to Maggie's experience, involving a woman who had been removed for disrupting the flow while shopping in the store. Another was a teenager with autism who had been treated aggressively by security after his shopping cart accidentally bumped into another customer. The pattern was clear. Keenan's Market had a long-standing practice of removing people who didn't fit the store's ideal customer base, and Maggie, as much as it pained her to admit it, had been a part of that group. But uncovering the information wasn't enough. The real challenge would be proving it in court. The store's management was denying everything. Their stance was that Maggie wasn't removed because of her disability, but because she had caused a disturbance. Despite the fact that Maggie had been nothing but polite, trying to navigate the store the same way any other customer would. When Sarah confronted the store's legal team with the evidence she had gathered, their response was dismissive. "Your client is simply using her disability as an excuse," one of the store's lawyers had told her. "This isn't about discrimination. It's about maintaining a smooth shopping experience for all customers. It was an argument that felt hollow to Sarah, but she knew this kind of rhetoric was exactly what they would use to defend themselves. Despite the obstacles, Sarah wasn't willing to back down. Every conversation, every document, every interview felt like a step closer to exposing the truth. But each step forward also seemed to bring new challenges. With each legal motion, with each interaction with the store's defense team, Sarah found herself growing more determined and more frustrated. For Maggie, the emotional toll of the case was overwhelming. She found herself losing sleep, unable to focus on anything but the fight ahead. The humiliation of being thrown out of the store had only grown with time, especially when she thought about the many people who had likely faced the same treatment without anyone to stand up for them. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She felt a constant knot in her stomach, the sense that something had been taken from her. Not just her dignity, but a part of her belief in the goodness of the world around her. The act of being thrown out had felt like a physical assault. Someone had pushed her out of a space where she belonged, and it had left a deep scar. Maggie's family tried to be supportive, but even they couldn't fully understand the depth of what she was feeling. "Maggie, you've been through worse. You've fought for years against your illness," her father would say, trying to lift her spirits. "This is just another battle, and I know you'll win." But it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just a battle against MS. It was a battle against the world's perceptions. It was about her right to be seen as an equal, no matter how her body functioned. Maggie knew her father meant well, but she also knew that there was something more at play here than just another fight for survival. This was about dignity, and dignity couldn't be granted by just anyone. It had to be claimed. On the day of a crucial deposition, Maggie found herself sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the papers in front of her. Her hands shook as she read through her lawyer's notes. Notes about her statement, about her potential testimony. Everything seemed to blur together. Sarah had told her it was time to face the store's management head-on, to bring her case to light in front of a judge. But for Maggie, the thought of sitting in front of the store's defense team, hearing their dismissive words, made her stomach churn. It was at this point that Sarah called Maggie, her voice calm but full of urgency. "Maggie, I need you to come down to the office. We've got a meeting with the store's lawyers. They want to settle." The word settle didn't sit well with Maggie. It wasn't just about the money or even the public apology they might offer. It was about something deeper. A settlement might resolve the case, but it wouldn't resolve the issue. It wouldn't make the store change its practices. Maggie knew that if they settled too quickly, it would be like sweeping the problem under the rug, pretending it never happened. She hesitated. "What happens if we don't settle?" Sarah's response was steady, the tone she always used when there was no easy answer. "If we don't settle, we fight, and it won't be easy. They'll try to drag it out, make it look like you're just trying to make money off them. They'll twist everything to suit their story." Maggie closed her eyes, thinking of everything that had led her to this point. Her lawyer had fought for so many people. People like her, people who needed someone to stand up for them. Sarah wasn't backing down, and Maggie wasn't going to either. When Maggie walked into the lawyer's office the next morning, she had made her decision. There would be no settlement. Not this time. The meeting with the store's lawyers was tense from the start. Their defense was sharp, dismissive, and calculated. They painted Maggie as someone who had misunderstood the situation, as someone who had been overly sensitive about a minor issue. They brought up her disability as if it was a secondary point, something that might in some way explain her exaggerated response to being asked to leave. But Maggie wasn't backing down. She sat straight, her hands folded on the table, her voice calm but firm as she spoke up. "I don't want money. I don't want your apology. I want the truth to come out. I want people to know that this kind of treatment is unacceptable. It's not just about me. It's about every person who's ever been made to feel less than because of something they couldn't control." It was in that moment, as Maggie's words echoed in the quiet room, that the case truly became about more than just her. It wasn't just a story of a woman thrown out of a store. It was a story of the fight for justice, for recognition, for the right to be treated with dignity, no matter the circumstance. The meeting ended without a resolution, but for Maggie that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had spoken her truth. And in that moment, she knew that whatever happened next, she was no longer just a woman in a wheelchair. She was a woman with a voice, and that voice was going to be heard. The courtroom was silent as the judge struck his gavel, marking the beginning of an important moment in Maggie's life. She sat at the witness stand, her palms sweating despite the calmness she had tried to show. For the past few weeks, Sarah had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare her for the weight of the courtroom, the cold, impersonal environment, the sharp eyes of the lawyers, and the suffocating sense that every word she spoke could either hurt or help her case. Maggie's lawyer, Sarah Jensen, sat beside her posture calm, but her eyes focused on the opposing counsel. Across the room, Keenan's Market's defense team sat with confidence, their demeanor calm and assured. Their client was certain they would win this case and would do whatever it took to paint Maggie as an ungrateful customer who simply misunderstood the situation. The atmosphere was tense, but Maggie was determined to make her voice heard. She wasn't just defending herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced because of their disability. As she glanced down at her wheelchair, her resolve strengthened. The humiliation of being thrown out of Keenan's Market, the way she had been treated as if she didn't belong, it all led to this. The injustice she had experienced and the injustice others with disabilities face daily would be exposed for all to see. The trial had been long, full of twists and turns. The defense team had tried everything from questioning Maggie's version of events to attacking her character, suggesting that her disability made her overly sensitive and prone to exaggeration. But each time they tried to push her, Maggie stood firm, never wavering in her truth. Sarah had been right. They could try to undermine her, but the truth was something no one could take away from her. As the day came to an end and the final arguments were being made, something unexpected happened. Keenan's Market had introduced a new witness, a former employee of the store. This was someone who was supposed to back up their case, someone who would claim that Maggie had been causing a disturbance and that the security team had acted appropriately. The witness took the stand, a middle-aged man named Tom, with a neatly pressed suit and a calm, almost rehearsed demeanor. Maggie recognized him immediately from the days she had spent shopping at the store. He had been a cashier when she used to visit regularly, but seeing him now in this context felt like a betrayal. She had trusted him, even exchanged pleasantries over the years, but now he was being used as a pawn in the store's defense. Tom began his testimony with a carefully crafted statement. "I was working at Keenan's Market on the day in question," he said, his voice steady but lacking any real emotion. "I can confirm that Maggie was blocking traffic in one of the aisles and causing a disruption to other customers. Security was called to address the situation." Maggie's stomach twisted. She had never once blocked an aisle on purpose. She had always been careful, always aware of her surroundings. The implication that she had been disruptive felt like another slap in the face. She shot a glance at Sarah, who was listening intently, her jaw clenched in concentration. Sarah had warned her that the defense would use every tactic to discredit her, but hearing Tom's words firsthand made the betrayal feel real. This wasn't just about a store, it was about the people who had let her down, people who were willing to ignore the truth for their own benefit. Sarah rose from her seat, her voice calm but strong as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the witness." The judge nodded and Sarah stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Tom. "Mr. Williams," she began, "you claim that Maggie was blocking an aisle and disrupting traffic. Can you tell us exactly how long she was in the aisle? Were other customers actually complaining about her?" Tom shifted slightly, a hint of unease creeping into his posture. "I didn't hear complaints, but I saw her for a few minutes blocking the path." "A few minutes?" Sarah repeated. "You're telling us that in the course of your workday, you noticed Maggie for a few minutes and immediately decided she was a disruption?" "Yes," Tom replied, though there was a slight hesitation in his voice now. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Williams, were you working that day alone?" Tom paused, then shook his head. "No, I had other employees with me." "And did anyone else mention that there was a problem with Maggie?" "No," he admitted, his voice faltering slightly under Sarah's questioning. Sarah's gaze was sharp. "Then why, after a few minutes, was she suddenly considered such a problem that she was escorted out by security. She let the question hang in the air, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Is it possible, Mr. Williams, that you were instructed by management to remove customers who didn't fit the store's ideal image? Tom looked down, his fingers fidgeting with the cuff of his shirt. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy as the question lingered. Sarah's words had struck a chord, and for the first time Tom seemed unsure. Maggie's heart raced. Was this it? Was this the moment the truth would finally come to light? I don't know what you mean, Tom stammered, trying to regain his composure. Oh, I think you do, Sarah said, her voice calm but intense. I think you know exactly what I mean. You weren't just removing a disruptive customer, Mr. Williams. You were part of a pattern of removing people who don't conform to the image you want your store to project. And you know it. You've seen it happen with other customers, haven't you? Tom's eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, and for a moment Maggie could see the fear in his eyes. He knew what Sarah was implying, and the weight of it was sinking in. Slowly his shoulders slumped. He didn't speak, but his silence spoke volumes. The courtroom held its breath, the air thick with tension. Maggie's hands clenched tightly in her lap, the realization of what was happening starting to sink in. This wasn't just about her. This was about exposing a culture of discrimination, of people who were treated unfairly just because they didn't fit the mold society had set for them. Sarah turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I request that we hold Keenan's Market accountable for its discriminatory practices, which are evident in the testimony of their own employee. The judge paused, clearly considering the weight of the situation. His gavel came down with a decisive thud. We will take a short recess, he announced, and I will review the evidence presented. This case will continue in 30 minutes. As the courtroom buzzed with whispers, Maggie's heart raced. Her mind swirled with disbelief. Was this really happening? Had Sarah just exposed the store's entire defense in a single line of questioning? For the first time since the incident, Maggie allowed herself a glimmer of hope. This was it, the moment when everything changed, when her fight for justice could finally lead to something bigger. She had never felt more empowered, even in the face of the betrayal she had witnessed from someone she once trusted. In that courtroom, she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for anyone who had ever been cast aside because of their disability, their appearance, or their perceived difference. The battle was far from over, but Maggie knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. The truth was out now, and no matter the outcome, nothing could take that away from her. As Sarah gave her a small, reassuring smile, Maggie knew that no matter how this trial ended, she had already won. The trial didn't end with an immediate victory, but the courtroom drama set the stage for lasting change. Keenan's Market, realizing the weight of the public outcry and the strong evidence presented, decided to settle the case. Maggie received a formal apology, along with compensation for the emotional distress caused, but more importantly, the store promised to implement new policies to ensure fair treatment of customers with disabilities. For Maggie, the journey didn't stop there. She became an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities, speaking at public forums and working with organizations to create safer, more inclusive spaces. The fight that began in a grocery store transformed her, turning her from someone who had been silenced into someone who was now heard. Sarah Jensen, too, found herself changed. Her success in this case reinforced her belief in fighting for justice, not just for the vulnerable, but for anyone whose voice had been marginalized. She continued to take on cases that challenged discrimination, using her platform to create ripples of change. The story of Maggie Collins is a reminder that one voice, even one that feels small and ignored, can inspire others and bring about real change. It's not about perfection. It's about standing up when the world asks you to sit down and refusing to be silenced. Want more stories that inspire change and challenge the status quo? Subscribe now for fresh, impactful content delivered right to your inbox. Let's keep the conversation going.